Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you have an interest in an FDA regulated company or its products, this is the podcast for you. So today's podcast is about trust. And to quote our guest, it's trust. As in, it's all over. There's so much stuff out there. So if you are in, and we're gonna have a focus on today's trust. We're gonna talk about internal facing trust and what that means, connecting with leadership, connecting with employees, connecting with contractors, and what that means. But in the end, it's about trust. So if you are a leader in the life sciences, and I know a lot of you people listening in are, you should care about this conversation because this will hopefully help express the concerns and the internal strife you are dealing with, and becomes a reason for you to reach out to experts like our guest today. Our guest today is, as she phrased it to me last time, Libro Vidani, very Italian. I haven't stopped thinking about the explanation of how to say her name. So I'm excited to have her back on. And Lee, it's so good to have you. Again, could you talk about the book you have, by the way?
Right. Thanks, Darshan.
Yeah.
There it is.
Trust me.
So one of the things that we talked about was, for anyone who's listening right now, I am going to give away a signed and autographed book that I'll mail to you. We'll ask a question at the end, so pay attention. And one person will have a signed autographed book sent to them in the mail.
From the expert on trust. And Lee, to be clear, you actually won an award recently around the work you do. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Well, Trust Across America is an organization that is just gathers a lot of the top thought leaders in trust. So this year I received a Lifetime Achievement Award as a top thought leader. So, you know, what does that mean? I'm not quite sure. It means that, you know, I'm so narrow. I have this narrow focus on trust. It's what I do. It's what I talk about. It's what I live and breathe. So I think that has everything to do with it.
Well, it also speaks to the volume of thought leadership you bring to the table and the amount that people can learn from you. So Lee, let's start by talking a little bit about your week. How was your week? What did you work on this week?
Well, I think I told you on Tuesday I had my shot. So I had the second shot of the Moderna COVID vaccine. And so that was my week. It was thinking about the shot, getting the shot, feeling sick from the shot, feeling better from the shot. So that was kind of the whole thing. And I was reading an interesting article, and they said, what is the least effective vaccine? And the least effective vaccine is one that people won't take. And so right now we have a vaccine that has been proven to really help people avoid dying from COVID. I don't think, you know, like the jury seems like it's still out on, does it prevent people from getting COVID? But even if you do get it, you're not going to die from it.
So it's interesting you talk about that. So let's talk a little bit about your own experiences with the second shot. It's a milestone almost. 2 years ago, no one even knew what Moderna was.
Yeah.
This year, getting the second shot is a milestone in a lot of people's lives. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you. Huge relief. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
My question to you is, did you hope you could get the Pfizer vaccine, or did you hope that you could get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? Like, one of the reason I asked that question is one of the case studies everyone talks about in terms of in sales, and they talk about the Johnson and Johnson Tylenol catastrophe and the amount
Right.
of huge goodwill that that Johnson and Johnson got because of the way they engaged with customers when
Right.
that tragedy was happening. I think it was in the 1980s, and it's a
You know,
case
it's
study.
interesting because I actually talk about it in
Oh,
my book, and it was James Burke. He was the CEO at the time, and
uh-huh.
he received an award from the government for being, in fact, I've got that here too. So the in Canada, it would be, I'm trying to think of the name of it, where, okay. So he was able to go in, and I don't know if you know the story about this. Do you know?
Please.
Okay. So James Burke, and I'm just going to get to the page. So he took over as president of Johnson and Johnson. He asked his managers to review the corporate credo. And the reason he was so adamant, he said that there's no sense having the words on the wall if people weren't going to follow it. So he made them go through it, and he rewrote it, and then he had that as kind of, this is how we will live. So when the Tylenol, the horrible thing that happened with Tylenol is it was 1982, 7 people were poisoned from taking Tylenol. And so what they did is they removed all of the Tylenol from that particular pharmacy, and they checked it out. And they found that it didn't come from the local factory. So they knew that it didn't happen at the, you know, where they actually built it. And different bottles were poisoned, so they came from kind of different locations. Sorry, that's my dog.
Totally
So
okay.
that's Booker.
Hi,
So
Booker.
what he did, he could have just removed those bottles and everybody would have been happy. And what he said was no, he wanted to get the trust of everybody. So he had all of the Tylenol removed and destroyed. And that's something else that sometimes happens with pharmacies. He could have removed it and then sold it to another country. And you hear about that happening. But he said, no, let's make sure that if there's any possibility, we get rid of it. But his handling of it was kind of a hallmark of what you can do to gain customer trust. And then he went further, and there never used to be the little seals on top of drug bottles. That was something else that he implemented. So here's what he said, and I'm going to read what Burke said in an interview with a magazine. He said, "Trust has been an operative word in my life. It embodies almost everything you can strive for that will help you to succeed. You tell me any human relationship that works without trust, whether it is a marriage or a friendship or a social interaction, in the long run, the same thing is true about business." So he was just, you know, he didn't take all of the credit for the success in handling it, but he also ended up getting all kinds of awards for how he was able to handle the crisis. So right now you have a company that, you know, a pharma company, and our lifespan 100 years ago, our average lifespan was 54 years, and now it's 79. So you would think that with pharma, we would have even more trust. But you have situations where you have some pharma companies who have raised a pill from $13.50 to $750, which was a necessary cancer pill. So even though that's not all of the pharma companies, I think that there's a whole, by association, people aren't trusting as much. So I kind of think that's interesting. What happened with Burke is that was how the company operated under his leadership. Johnson and Johnson has had its own difficulties over a few years, but I think they've come back. And I really believe that trust has to be more than a word, because you hear so much where people think that it's about reputation. It's not about reputation. They hire PR firms to deal with reputation. But if the company is really interested in operating with trust, then the reputation will follow. So the first one, I talked about my 5 tenets of trust, which is caring, commitment, consistency, competence, and communication. So how do you bring those into your company and how it operates, and the credo that you have all of your people follow?
It's funny you say that. A family member of mine is a ex Johnson & Johnsonian. I don't know how, ex-employee of Johnson & Johnson, but he was pretty high up the food chain. He's since retired, and even today he talks about the credo of Johnson & Johnson. So it speaks to the impact that credo has had in just the operations of the company. So I just find that very interesting. But let's speak to that.
Okay.
You spoke about the tremendous value that engagement had in how Johnson & Johnson dealt with that crisis.
Right.
But today you are perfectly happy to get the Moderna vaccine.
Oh, absolutely.
You didn't go, I want to get the more convenient Johnson & Johnson vaccine.
No, I was just happy to get the vaccine. And, like I did my due diligence. I read about it. I read, how they actually developed the vaccine. And I have enough family members who are, how could you possibly get this? It only took them a year. It should have taken longer. And like, Darshan, you can speak to this. The coronavirus vaccines have been around for 15 years. COVID is in the coronavirus family. So they had developed a lot of this technology, like all of this stuff that anyone who's listening, I'm not telling you something that you couldn't explain even better to me, because I'm just a layperson who, when I need to learn something, I go on trusted sites. They're ones that, like CDC or the World Health Organization, or I'll look, I'll go to where the company's actually developed it and read through things that they've done. One of the things that helps me to trust is the transparency. And transparency means that they tell you as much as they can, good and bad. I believe people to be more truthful if they tell me where there's some concerns. If they try and, there's a saying, and I lived in the Maritimes in Canada for years, blowing warm air up your kilt. So if someone's blowing warm air up your kilt, it means they're just doing something to make it feel good. And there's not a lot of substance.
I don't even know how to respond to. I love it. Who knew Canadians had a sense of humor? I'm loving it.
Yeah. Well, every Canadian does. We have a dry sense of humor. So yeah. But so when you're looking at that, I want to hear everything that's happening. And so, if a company tells, if they're to have a conversation, and I do believe that Johnson & Johnson, the head of Johnson & Johnson and the head of Pfizer had a conversation about the vaccine, and they brought out a lot of the problems. And so that gives me a lot more confidence, even though I went with Moderna because it was what was offered. Honestly, that was the reason.
Which is interesting though, isn't it? So does that, I have several questions already, but the big question that I have is, if you didn't have, is trust impacted by choice? So can you make a choice if you simply don't, I'm not phrasing this properly, but can you make a choice if you simply don't trust the company? Or if you do trust the company, do your choices not matter anymore?
I will choose a company I trust before anything else. So honestly, I have some good friends, and I don't want to disparage anyone, because if you have an opportunity to get the AstraZeneca vaccine and it's available, get it. Honestly, get it. But if it was all lined up and I had a choice between Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca, my first choice might be Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer, just because of the trust that they've, that I feel from the transparency that the leadership has exhibited.
Now, that's an interesting question, the transparency that the leadership has exhibited. how do you begin to trust these leaders? Is there a default amount of trust a leader gets just by being the leader of a reputable company? Or good.
I think that there is, but here's a little bit of the stats around how we, the higher up a person goes,
Yeah.
the less they're trusted. So an entry-level person is going to be trusted more than a senior leader. So it's kind of probably the reverse of what I would have thought, but it shows that leaders believe they are trusted, usually around the 80% mark more than they're actually trusted.
Explain that sentence. They're trusted 80% less than what they actually are. Is that
so a leader believes they're trusted more than they actually are. A leader would say, of course.
Yeah.
I operate with trust. I'm trusted, like, if they were to guess. So if I said, Darshan, you're head of this big agency. Yeah. Do you believe people trust you? And you would say yes. And I'd say, so on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest, where would you put yourself? And you might say, no, I'm an 8.5 or a 9. And then if I were to get 20 people who worked for you and I had them interview you, you would find that you would get a lower number.
Of course. So it's just, so what you're saying is 80% of the time I am a lower number, not necessarily that I am at 20%. It's just, it's a lower number.
It's a lower number. So you're just not as trusted as you believe you are. So there are some leaders that manage to actually have high levels of trust, and they do that because they their communication is such that they are transparent. They are willing to tell people the good and the bad. And I get it that people think that they should hide bad news so that people won't panic, but the chance of panic is very, very low. Most people will not panic if they've got all of the information, but it has to follow, kind of, you give people the news, you tell them, here's what's going wrong. And then you give them, here's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
So you balance it with a plan. So if you just go, the sky's falling, and I have no clue what to do, well, then obviously people might not trust you. But if you say the sky's falling, but we've got a steel umbrella and it's going to keep it from hitting us on the head, okay, that was probably the worst example I've ever used. But
it was pretty good, actually, though. So that raises an interesting question, because what I hear you saying is that executives naturally, and more importantly, the higher up you go, you're less trusted. But it also raises the question, the lower down you are, the less you have to be trusted, though, don't you?
Yeah. So there is that correlation too. And you haven't been tested as much. But you're also, like when you go into an organization, there is an expectation that you're going to be able to do X. We interviewed a high trust leader, and this was years ago when he was CEO of, I think it was at Mandalay Bay, and it was the huge center in Las Vegas. And he said that, when they're building a new structure and it's a multi-million dollar structure, they have to make sure that, if there is a problem, people let them know right away. Because if there's a huge problem, they can throw a lot of money at it, get it cleared up. But if someone tries to hide the problem, then the problem escalates. And instead of just having, a small problem, they have now a huge problem. So there's an expectation that people behave even when they're hired, that here's our expectation. You tell us the truth. If there's a problem, we listen to you. But there's people who work for companies that are afraid to tell their boss the bad news because they're punished for it. What happens when a problem is hidden? Then that small problem gets blown up. So the leadership has to establish that you're not going to be penalized if there is a mistake, and we'll fix it. If you're making the same mistake over and over and over again, that's a different situation. But you have to set up an organization that allows people to make mistakes, learn from the mistakes, and move on. So, so much of trust has to do with how a leader leads his people. And if he trusts, then, if he trusts his people, if he trusts that he hired properly, and he shows that, if he's transparent when he makes a mistake, because I don't know a person alive who doesn't screw up on, pretty regular basis. So if he's willing to disclose those mistakes, it lets other people, admit.
That raises the question of if you are, how should I put this? How do you explain cult-like leaders? And what I mean by that is I've been an employee in companies, and when I'm an employee in a company, one of the things I find myself doing very unknowingly, but I see it after the fact, is I'm so part of the team that I found myself trusting my leaders more implicitly than possibly I even should.
Okay.
And it was very much, it's about the team and we will succeed. And you are the quarterback and you're leading us to success. You have my support. Is there a difference between trust and support?
Well, I think they go together, but I do think there is a difference between trust and support. I mean, I can support someone and maybe not completely trust them. So trust, trust is those 5 tenets: caring, commitment, consistency, competence, and communication, and all of the other things that enter into it, like being transparent, and that comes into the communication. So support, I think it's maybe a result of trust.
Okay.
But I don't see it as the same at all.
Okay. And we being me, raise the concept of a cult-like figure who's the leader. And a good example would be, cults, but also say a Steve Jobs who ran Apple.
Right.
You're kind of looking at him going, I want to follow that guy. You will take us into the promised land.
Right.
How do they? I don't think Steve Jobs was particularly transparent, as best as I've heard. But
no, I heard he was actually a bit of a yeah.
So how does he get that type of trust?
I haven't analyzed him, so you're just going to get my guess. I would think that people believe that he was just so competent and such a genius that that they kind of overlooked some of his faults, because I think he cared deeply for his company and for what it was able to produce. I don't know enough about him. Did he care for the individuals who worked for him? I kind of heard, it seems to me that there's this nagging thing that he didn't always treat people really well.
I've heard similar stuff.
So where did the cult thing come from? I think because he was able to achieve some things. I mean, some of the things that he said, he wanted the images on his phone to be so clear that you could, what was it? If it was food, you'd want to lick the image. I can't remember. I'm probably screwing that up completely. And someone who's listening is probably going, that's not what he said. But he was able to get things from people because he had such great vision.
Okay. So
was that trust though? I don't know.
I guess what I'm really asking then, based on what you just said, is that there are situations where you'll trust someone who you possibly, given more objective rules, wouldn't. And
there's so much that's involved with following someone like that too, because I think that you can get caught up in the whole movement. I've done work for belong to organizations where everybody followed the leader to such an extent that, my husband used to joke and say, are you going into a cult meeting? And I've never really been somebody who follows to that extent. And so when I see that happening, I usually take a big step back. So I think it has to do with the personality of the people who are attracted to that. Mm-hmm. Because I really believe that if you completely trust yourself, then that attraction to follow a cult-like figure isn't quite as appealing, because you trust because a lot of this is that they convince you to follow in a way that usually doesn't seem to me to be very healthy. And if you completely trust yourself, you might be able to catch that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does actually. It makes a lot of sense. And I'll tell you why I think it makes sense. They fulfill something within you that you wish you could meet. And they need that for you. I guess my question then is, are very trustworthy leaders necessarily really good readers of people? Or is leadership not necessarily connected to interpersonal relationships?
No, I think Darshan, that one of the things that I studied first was emotional intelligence. And so that ability to connect with people, the interpersonal skills, is definitely something that people are attracted to. I mean, if I go into a hospital for an operation, people have said, do you really care if the surgeon has any people skills? Well, even in that instance, maybe not, if you're doing a scale, maybe I care less about that than I care about their competence. Yep. But I still want them to have enough interpersonal skills that they can ask me, where am I feeling the pain? And if they don't even have that skill, then are they going to be as effective? And so it comes down to, like a really good leader, I think, listens to his people, because he recognizes that even if that person doesn't have the same skill and competence that they have, he'll learn something from them.
So. Which really raises this interesting question, because for the most part, and this is, I apologize for my lawyer stuff coming out, but every contract usually ends with, whenever we say he, we also mean she.
Right.
And we've referred to the quote-unquote he leader throughout this conversation. I assume it also.
Yeah.
But now, speaking in generalities, do female leaders bring a different set of skills to the table, and therefore, for example, they connect differently, versus male leaders who bring something else to the table? And have you seen any generalities, or not quite? That's just not been studied, or it's not been relevant, or any of those things?
Yeah, I think there's been a few studies that are done on it. There's also a lot of it has to do with, there are different strengths that men and women bring to the leadership role. And now we're getting into the emotional intelligence side of things. But, I think that we'll see a different kind of leader come out, because for the longest time, like when I was going into leadership positions, a lot of times you were encouraged to push down any of your empathy and come across more from what we would perceive a man to operate in a leadership role. Wow. And now I think it's being recognized that women bring strengths of leadership because of their compassion and empathy. Not that men didn't have it, but it's just, like there's different strengths, and maybe it was more allowed for women to show that compassion and empathy. So I think that, I'm really hopeful that we're going to have a new type of leader. And I'm encouraged with the number of women who are coming into leadership roles. So I don't know, that didn't really answer it, but I think I want to wait and see what happens.
That's a great thing, which is, I think the idea that a future leader will bring in the best qualities of both men and women.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
And may not be necessarily tied to their own personal gender. Express it. Fascinating concept. When you talk about diversity, and leadership, and you try to talk about people following a diverse leader, and I use the term diverse leader in a very broad concept, but the way I mean it is there any data saying that we've always talked about diversity being a strength because they bring people who are diverse bring a different set of questions, a different set of experiences to the table, and that's great for the growth of an organization. But as you start going further and further up the food chain, is it necessary from a trust development standpoint for employees to see themselves in you? Or and I guess the reason I'm asking that question is if you are a leader who looks very different, does that necessarily, or I guess necessarily is a bad term, but does that tend to reduce the amount of trust a employee might have in you? So I'll give you an example. Let's say I became CEO. Would a white female look at me and go, he doesn't quite remind me of myself? Do I trust him as much as if I was instead a white female? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, except, if you look at one of the more successful leaders for Microsoft, isn't it Satya Nadella?
Yeah, Nadella. Yeah. I guess that's true.
And did I pronounce his name correctly? I apologize to everyone if I didn't, but
no, you're close. Close enough.
Yeah. So he is one of, I think, like I've read the things that he has said and how he treats people, and he is extremely well respected. And I think of the president of PepsiCo, who is a woman of Asian descent, who is also brilliant. So I think that what we're seeing is that people are recognizing that great leadership doesn't look one way. And if they're not recognizing that leadership doesn't look one way, then, like they're dinosaurs. Is that harsh? They should go.
No, I don't think that's harsh to say that leadership comes in different forms, and if anything, the scope of leadership is being expanded. I could keep asking 1,000 more questions. It's ridiculous. Before we go, what's a question you'd like to ask the audience?
Okay, so I want to know your best action or behavior to increase trust in your sphere. And that, okay, I think my tongue got all twisted. What is one thing that you do to build trust? Simpler question. What is one thing that you do to build trust?
I'm going to try to answer to get us going.
Put the answers, and what we'll do is we'll pick someone from the group, and then Darshan will get in touch with you. He'll connect you with me. I'll get your address and get a book personalized and mailed to you. And also, if you have a question for me, please shoot it to me, and I'll answer it to my best ability. You can see that if I don't know the answer, I'm pretty comfortable going, yeah, I don't know that one.
I honestly thought it was really, really cool. I'm going to answer the question you asked, though. How do I try to build trust? I personally think I try to build trust by being transparent. I think I struggle with that because, like you said, it feels like a moment of weakness.
Yeah.
It feels like I don't need to scare people. And honestly, it's a little anxiety causing, but that's how I think people shouldn't have things surprise on them. So I try to be as transparent as I can. So that's mine. But I like to believe that my competence will show for itself, but we'll find out. So we landed up during this podcast, we landed up talking about trust. We talked about trust and leadership. We talked about the different forms and formats it takes. Everything from diversity in terms of race and gender, all the way through to a little bit of discussion around age and dinosaurs, if you will, for lack of a better term, and the implications of that. We talked about cult leadership, which was not a topic I expected me to get into, but that was kind of cool. Did I miss anything?
No, I think we kind of went we went from here to here, didn't we?
We did. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical advice or even advice around trust of any kind. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. But for those of you who missed it, Lee, where can they actually reach you?
So go to my website, which is leebrovedani.com, and Lee is L-E-A, and Brovedani is Brovedani. So leebrovedani.com, you can get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to help your organization or you to build and grow your trust.
And how does that usually work when they reach out? What does that process look like?
Well, first of all, we find out what they want. So the whole thing that you always do with training is, where are you now? Where do you want to go? And what is it that I need to do in between to get you from here to there?
Yeah.
So
very,
it's
very
a discovery. And if I'm not the right person for you, I will send you to somebody else. It's my promise.
I'm sure you will be the right person for a lot of the projects. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment. Please subscribe. You can find me at DarshanTalks on Twitter, or just go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. Thanks again,
Great.
Lee. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Darshan.